to an in-person Friends Forum. It's been a while. We haven't done this since 2020, so we're really excited to be back here. I'm Louise Sue. I'm a retired naval captain, and I'm the chair of the events committee for the Friends. And I'm going to first, before I get started on our introduction of the speaker today, I'd like to introduce Scott Healy, who's the vice president of the Friends of Canadian War Museum, and he'd like to say a few words. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Louise. My name is Scott, as Louise said. I was just elected the vice president of the Friends of the Canadian War Museum. I'm also the chair of the Ways and Means Committee, which is responsible with working with Louise on the Friends forums here, the newsletter that most of you get every month, the book room, which is just outside the door here, Adopt a Book, and other streams of effort to both increase membership, provide visibility and communication to the members, and also to raise money. So thank you again very much for coming out, as Louise said, for our very first Friends Forum in person. And of course, over the last year, we've had about 5, I think it is, virtual, Friends Forums virtually, which have been, on Zoom. Today, we're not going to be live streaming it. We're going to be taping it, and it will be for your colleagues and friends that were unable to come. They'll be able to pick it up on the web page or through other means that will be communicated through the newsletter. As the vice president and working with the new board, our mission, most of you know what it is to promote the War Museum and provide funding for programs within this museum. So for all of you that are members and hold a membership, and I appreciate that very much, and thank you for your continued support and donations. For all of you that are not, and maybe just get the newsletter, or this is your first time at a Friends event, I would strongly encourage you to consider us as an organization to be a member of. It does not cost a lot. You get a tax receipt for that, but we would not be able to do the programming, to do the things that we want to do, not just for you as members, because things have certainly advanced in the last couple of years with communication, as we all found out through the pandemic, but also in our mission to provide funds to the museum so that they can carry forward with their mission. So again, thank you very, very much for all those who have continued support to the Friends, and for all of you that may consider seriously, join the Friends, go on the website, pretty easy to find, and sign up as a member, and that would be very much appreciated. Enjoy today's presentation, our first in person again, and hopefully we'll have many more in the future. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon again. The title of today's presentation, as you can see, is Wind, Gravel, and Ice. Now, we are extremely excited to hear this story today because it's not a story that's well known, and it's always nice when we can come and have a little bit of a treasure opportunity, and this is clearly one of them. Now, the book that was actually written has been highly acclaimed by historians that we're very familiar with, like Brigadier General Dave Patterson and Mike McCorgan. They have both commented on this fact that the story's been extremely well researched, and that it's a really good, much needed story that has not been well told. So, on behalf of the Friends today and myself, and of course, would you please join me in welcoming today's presenter, Christina Chowaniec.
Thanks so much, Louise and Scott, and thank you to the Friends of the Museum for the invitation to be here today, and thanks to all of you for your interest in this story. And I'd like to say a special thanks to Marilyn, who's standing in the door there. And Marilyn, thanks for so much, for everything. She's just been an absolute, she was one of, just an avid supporter of this project since the very beginning. I can't imagine being here without her. And at every turn, she just knew exactly the right person to connect me to kind of keep this project going. And so, Marilyn, thank you. So this project has been a journey. It's the only way to describe it. From the minute that I discovered the story to being here with you today, and at every moment I meet new people and it grows, and that's for me where the joy always came from, was from connecting with people who are interested in this history. what I'd like to do today is I've collected a wonderful bunch of photographs from both personal photo albums and from archival sources, and I want to share some of them with you today. And I think they hopefully will transport you to Iceland in 1940 and really give you a sense of what it would have been like to have been a Canadian soldier on the ground in 1940. And it's a nice complement to the book. These are sort of the visuals and sort of the general experience of what it would have been like for a Canadian soldier, and the book contains the personal stories about my grandfather. It's written in first person in his voice, and it's about what they were doing and how they experienced their new world and how it changed them and how they came to know the locals and things like that. So there's no book spoilers in here today, so not to worry about that. And I think before I start the slideshow, I think I just want to share with you two mini stories, because this project has been more than 10 years in the making. I discovered the story in 2010, so it's been like 12 years, and there's so many moments. This is like not my day job, so there's so many moments where this project was on the back burner and could have kind of burned out. And it's just a story that really wanted to be told. When it was just sitting there idling, I would get an email or a phone call, or somebody would discover a photograph, and it would just sort of push it forward again. Yeah, it's just really amazing that it sort of felt like there were bigger forces at work a little bit along the way. So the first moment was when I went to the archives at Ottawa quite early on in the project to dig out my grandfather's service records and the regimental war diaries. And the regimental war diaries are a document that is kept for every day that the regiment is on active duty. And every day somebody dutifully records things like, the date, the weather, where they were, and maybe one or two lines about what they were doing. And a regiment is about 800 soldiers, so it's not a huge level of detail. And so imagine my surprise when I opened the war diary, and there's a supplemental diary for 33 men of my grandfather's platoon in Iceland for the 8 months that they were in this air base that was stationed quite far away from the rest of the regiment. And so there was a little bit of extra paperwork involved, and all this stuff was in the archives. So suddenly you go from this global conflict with millions of people to 33 men in one place, and now a story can unfold. And so that's really when I started writing the story, was this war diary that kind of created the framework for the stories that I was then able to kind of extrapolate on top of. And the second thing happened sort of in Iceland, or just before I went to Iceland. I was there in 2017. I found a residency very close to the air base where my grandfather had been stationed. So I felt like this was kind of a good omen. And you make your travel arrangements, and you go there, and what did I think? They're just gonna arrive in a foreign country and all of the people and things that I needed to do just magically appear? And then they did. And one of the women who was the director at the residency was an amateur historian herself, and she connected me to her community, and Icelandic friends here in Ottawa connected us to their community. And my emails to researchers and professors went answered, and all this came together really seamlessly. And it just always felt that that it just, as I say, this story. I think the funny thing is like how stories, you don't choose stories choose you. And I didn't go looking for the story. I wasn't looking to write a book, and this story put itself in my way. And it's just been an amazing experience bringing it to life. So. The story starts here with this guy. This is Claude Arthur Hill. He's my grandfather. He served in the Cameron Highlanders of Ottawa. He enlisted in September 1939. He served through the end of the war. He served in Normandy and in Holland, and he met my grandmother, Ruth Lauer, in Holland. And they were married there, and he came back and spent the rest of his adult life near Brockville. And he passed away when I was 11. And many years after his death, in 2010, I was given his journal. And I don't know, why I got the journal at that time or why it appeared, but I had it. And it's this lovely, document that my mom had actually given him in the 80s. It was just a journal. He loved reading, and he was an avid and storytelling and writing. And so this journal is filled with snapshots of his life, from his childhood in Smith Falls, being a young man, working at Frost and Woods in Smith Falls, his early days in the army in Ottawa and Normandy and Holland. And then he talks about this place called Caldenarns in Iceland. I had no idea that he'd been in Iceland. No idea that the Canadians had been in Iceland. And so then I was like, oh, that's really interesting. So I went to research it, and there wasn't even a Wikipedia page about it. There's nothing. So there's really nothing written about this. And so this set me off on this 10+ year journey to bring this story to life. And I think I talked a little bit about the magic of greater forces at work. And I think the other piece is Iceland itself. Iceland is a character in the book. It's a character in the slides you'll see today. Just going there was so important to being able to bring this to life, to be able to be on the land, to experience the weather and the sight lines, and to stand where he stood. And the airbase where he was stationed in Caledon's was a farm. That's why they chose it as an airbase. It was one of the few flat places in all of Iceland, and it's still a farm today. And the grandson of the man Jörundur, who had owned it during the war, is still there. And so I was able to get in contact with him. I was able to meet him and his family, to go out on the airbase and to walk on the land. And that was just really amazing, just kind of bringing it all together. I think the other thing I want to say is that this is what I'm going to show you is really the beginning. This is 1940. Iceland was occupied for the whole war, and then it played a very significant role in NATO. It was a founding member of NATO, and it played a role all through the Cold War. There were American troops stationed there, until the 2000s. And so this is the beginning where there was nothing, and they were building everything from scratch. And so things really did change and improve as time went on. So I just want to give you a little bit of a background. Why Iceland? So as you can see, Iceland sits roughly halfway between Britain and North America. And Britain relied almost entirely on shipments through the Atlantic to sustain its war effort. And in May, June of 1940, Germany controlled Denmark, Norway, the Low Countries, France, and the naval blockade that had been effective up until that point was very difficult to maintain, because Germany now had direct access to the Atlantic from France and Norway. And so I think we're more familiar with the Battle of the Atlantic, them launching the U-boat war and planes, and really the massive attrition that it took on the Allied shipping. And Iceland, for its part, was a sovereign state, but it shared its defense and foreign affairs interests with Denmark. So when Denmark fell in April of 1941, Iceland declared itself independent, but it was completely defenseless. It had no army or air force or navy, and so Britain was really determined to not let it fall into German hands. And when diplomatic measures didn't succeed in convincing them to join on the side of the Allies, in May 1940 they sent a battalion of Marines to secure the island. And so from 1940 the troop build-up kind of started. The Canadians, the Royal Regiment of Canada from Toronto, arrived in June 1940, and the Fusiliers Mont-Royal and the Cameron Highlanders of Ottawa in July 1940. So July 1940, there's about 2,500, 3 regiments, 3 battalions, so about 2,500 Canadians supporting the British 49th Division, which had been evacuated from Norway. And when they were in Iceland, they changed their divisional patch to be a polar bear, even though there were not, and still today are not, polar bears in Iceland. And actually the really cute thing about this is that this is one example, but this patch is made what they call in theater, and so there's so many different versions of this patch that you can find. The polar bear is standing in different directions. He's embroidered differently. So this is kind of a cool piece of history. Right. And so I think the other thing that I need to do to set the scene here a little bit is to give you a little bit of a sense of what Iceland was like in 1940. So it was a small country at 120,000 people. It was one of the smallest in Europe and one of the poorest. It relied almost entirely on fishing and agriculture, and very little industry. And there wasn't a lot of infrastructure because it was such a small country. So there was no barracks and warehouses and buildings and things to rent that you would if you had been in some other European city. So everything the soldiers needed had to be built, and everything they needed to build that needed to come from somewhere else. And so these are just some photos actually from a Canadian Geographic from 1940. They did a special in Iceland, I guess, because at that point people knew that Canadians were in Iceland. And so these are barrels of fish oil on the docks. That was one of their major exports. And then this photo here on the right, just kind of the pastoral scenes of Iceland. And the other thing was not just the infrastructure, but the roads. There were very few of them. Very few of them were paved. They were just really difficult, and they certainly weren't used to handling transport and the heavy equipment that comes with an army. And then you put weather on that, and these roads became very, very difficult. As I said, my grandfather was stationed at an RAF base that they were building at Caledon's, which was only 45 miles from Reykjavik, and it took between 4 and 6 hours to drive there. And so in contrast, when I was there, it took like 40 minutes. So just to give you an idea of how things have changed. And the other thing is that there's no railways, there's no airports, no airfields. There were not much in the way of natural resources, and there's no trees, so therefore no lumber. And in contrast, just to sort of put things in context, Reykjavik was a very modern and well-connected city. It had universities and cafes and movie theaters. So where you were stationed in the country would have had a really big impact on your experience. Okay. So they enter the Canadians. So the Canadians, as I say, arrived in two different deployments: the Royal Regiment of Canada in June and the Cameron Highlanders and the Fusiliers Mont-Royal in July. And this story was told to me by an Icelandic historian who was a boy at the time. And you have to remember that this was an invasion. The Icelandic Prime Minister had asked the locals to treat the new arrivals with the politeness due to guests, but they were uninvited guests, and this was an occupation. And there's a lot of fear and misapprehension about what it was going to look like when you put tens of thousands of troops on top of a really small, 100,000, 120,000 people. So I think people were a little bit worried about the new arrivals. And so the Camerons were a Highland regiment, so they had a full pipe and drum band. And this photo on the right is not from Iceland, it's from a parade in Ottawa, but I just wanted to kind of give you a sense of what their full regalia looked like. So when they got off the boat, they put on their full regalia, and they led the Canadians from the dock to the staging area through town. And we're all pretty familiar with the sound of a bagpipe, but if you've never heard the sound of a bagpipe before, you can imagine that would be a very new, different, and interesting experience. So you have this parade so they become a spectacle. They're now a parade. You have the pipe and the drums and all of the guys in their their tartans. And I think there's this moment where the fear was replaced with surprise, maybe, and maybe that's all you need is a few minutes to kind of drop your guard and maybe form a new impression of the people that you're encountering. And I don't like this photo on the left. I think it's a bit, I don't know if you can quite see, but just over here there's like a kid, and he's kind of pulling on his mom's arms so I can pull him closer to the parade, and there's some family sort of standing. So they're not like cheering in the street, but they're kind of, there's some renewed interest about these people who have just arrived. And in contrast, when the Canadians go to their staging area just outside of Reykjavik, where they spend the first few days before they get deployed across the country, they, it's the first week of July, it's 2 weeks after solstice, and there's not a lot of darkness. So at 2200 hours, the bugle calls for lights out, and everybody goes to bed, and nobody's sleeping because the sun is out. And at 2300 hours, the bugle goes and calls again, and still the sun doesn't set, and the bugle goes out again at midnight and calls again. And so there's just this lovely, the War Diaries just describe all this laughter, and everybody, just sort of with the prank, and everybody kind of understanding that they're not at home anymore. And so I just love this contrast between sort of Icelanders experiencing Canadians for the first time and Canadians experiencing Icelanders for the first time, or Iceland for the first time, where the normalities of home don't apply anymore. And I think I want to add too that these are young men. They haven't been very far from home. The deployment was very sudden. They only had a couple of maybe like 10 days before they left. So they didn't have a lot of time to prepare, to say goodbye. And they had no idea where they were going. They probably thought they were going to like Scotland or England. So imagine their surprise when the boat arrives in Reykjavik. And so this is they arrive on the Empress of Australia. It's a huge CPR cruise ship, like liner that had been converted to take troops. And so this boat is so big it can't tie up to the dock. And so it has to anchor offshore, and then they have to take this little boat, 30 men at a time. There's 2,000 men on the boat to get into town. So just to give you an idea. And this is the port of Reykjavik. And I'm not going to go into too much detail about it, but only to say that it was small. It only had 3 berths, and it just wasn't big enough to take the material loads that it needed to, right? Like, there's a lot of bottlenecks and a lot of logistics that got tied up at this little port. And so that affected, that'll come into play with everything else that kind of happens next on some level. So from the soldier's perspective, kind of what did it look like? So everybody lived in tents until at least September. Their uniforms and their tents and their camo nets and their trucks and everything were standard issue Army khaki. So khaki, when you put it against the landscape of Iceland, looks like this. Looks like snow on dirt. And so So some ingenious person came up with an idea of painting the tent. So they mixed the lava dust with water and some kind of binding agent to make paint. And so you can see in the bottom right where they've started to paint the tents and what a difference it makes to camouflaging them against the landscape. And also just here, in those early days, they didn't have a lot of the kind of material things that they needed, like concrete and sandbags. And so here they put sod around their tent to keep the wind out. Yeah, and so in those early days, they were, because of a lot of the problems at the port, they were kind of badly supplied, and even, the Cameron Highlanders are a machine gun regiment, and they didn't really have any machine guns, and many of them were dual purpose, and they weren't, they had a lot of field wearing that wouldn't really have held up in a sustained fight. They didn't have enough trucks, and as I said, they don't have concrete and sandbags. And you can see in the background here, this is something that they wouldn't have built. It would have been a gate on an Icelandic road that predated them, but just, I think them kind of understanding that they needed to use what was around them, right? So that kind of idea of thinking like an Icelander and using what was around you to make yourself at home. And they were really spread out in those early days, really, down to the company level, and in my grandfather's case, the platoon level. So there was a lot of isolation, and as I said, it was hard driving between them. You didn't have a lot of trucks, and when they did, it takes hours to drive between units. There was no airfields, so therefore no planes. There were no heavy artillery or mechanized troop transport or anything like that. So this idea of a Fortress Iceland was still a little bit of a dream. And I like in the background there too, you can see that tent again has either sod or stones kind of piled around it. This photo to me is just so human. I just really like this photo. And the war divers just talk endlessly about the weather. I know Canadians like to talk about weather anyway, and the Canadians, and then put Canadians in Icelandic weather, and that's all the war divers are full of, just weather. And lots of bad weather, gales and wind and rain and I lost count. And certainly that was my experience too. Iceland's actually very small. It's about the size of Ohio. And so like driving around it is like, it's about 1,000 kilometers to drive around. It's not, in a circle. It's not really that big a place. And so weather moves really quickly over it. And it's just constantly changing. And part of the problem was that they just didn't have the right clothing. All their clothing was wool. And they didn't have proper rain protection. And the one thing they had were these gas capes. They were kind of like these ponchos. And so they were using them as rain protection until they were told not to, because they were for a gas attack, and you shouldn't be wearing them if there's no gas. And you can just see the land there too, like the wear and tear on their boots and on their tools. In late August, so this is like 6 weeks after their arrival, basically, they get a shipment of clothing, and one of the things that was in there was these leather jerkins. That's the thing the guy's wearing there on the right, on the left, sorry. And this was I just like the contrast. So that photo on the right, no matter what they're wearing, they're all wearing a leather jerkin. So clearly it was like a hot ticket item. And I think it was just, leather. It was really kept the wind out. It had some kind of waterproofing to it. And there's no wood, so there's no stoves. They didn't have coal or wood stoves yet. So there's just, just really tough conditions. Like you can't dry not a lot of drying conditions. You're living in wet clothing. You're working all the time. So yeah, it's very wearing. So this is a photo of one of the kitchens. And I like Iceland always present, right? Like behind it, that glacial moraine is just insane. I can't quite read it, but on the photo it says Hell's Kitchen. It's kind of like handwritten, and then tacked it up onto there. And the local food would have been like mutton and fish mostly. It was a long way from North America, so there wasn't a lot of fresh food. And with all the disruptions in the supply chains in those early days, a lot of the units were eating composite rations from the First World War. And there's one entry in the war diary where they talk, I think it was actually the Fusiliers war diary, because they were a little bit more floral with their language. And they were talking about how one of the tins had M&V stamped on it, and everybody had a different idea of what the M&V stood for. And so, as I mentioned, Reykjavik was a much bigger town. So when you're closer to bigger towns, there would have been more opportunities, organized events, sporting activities, that kind of thing. The Canadian YMCA actually was the one who provided all of the canteens and the facilities for Canadian soldiers in the way that the NAFI did for the British. And so they would have had passes into town to sort of take advantage of that kind of thing. But out in Caldedarns, where it's a long way and there weren't enough trucks to take them where they needed to go, there wasn't that much to do. I know they played a lot of baseball, and I think there was just a lot of legwork. It's exploring the area, doing recce's, making maps, figuring out communications. And then there's just massive, massive construction projects. They had to build everything, right? Their camp, the airfield, road maintenance, gun emplacements, trenches, communications, like just so much stuff, right? So they're building everything from scratch. So there just wasn't a lot of time for training, and certainly they spent more time with a shovel in their hand than a rifle. And the other great irony was that, despite working in bad weather wasn't great, but working in bad weather was better than being confined to a tent with nothing to do. This is a photo of a mail call. So they didn't get their first mail call until July 27th. So that was like more than 3 weeks after they arrived. And so that's, when you're alone and you're isolated and, you're homesick, that's very trying. And the war diaries talk a lot about there being a lot of enemies in Iceland and none of them were German. And so we talked about, the lack of supplies and the amenities and, mail and the boredom and the hard work and, the lack of creature comforts and sort of the constant hard labor and the separation from friends and from the rest of your units. I just threw in a couple more photos here of weather. So this is one of the trucks at the airbase after a rainstorm. And this photo is of one of the camps, like it's just kindling. So it's after a gale and there's just nothing left. You can see like all those, where the tents used to be. So yeah, the weather, as I say, Canadians like to talk about weather, but it was valid. They had a lot to talk about. And in so sort of mid-September, so let's say about 3 months after they arrive, they start to get sort of a better hutting situation. So they're called Nissan huts. It's the British style hut. So they come as a kit, and you snap it together. The only thing you have to do is pour the concrete floor at the bottom. And this is the Canadians had something that's called a Yukon style hut. So it's the sort of same idea as a kit, just a slightly different configuration. This one, in the top left, it says Bytown Camp, so this would have been the headquarters, one of the headquarters buildings of the Cameron Highlanders. And because of all the problems with shipping, it was decided that the British would provide the huts for the Canadians, so all of the Canadian units would have been stationed in the Nissan huts mostly instead of the Yukon style huts. And it really made a big difference to their lives. This photo on the left here, it's cozy in all senses. It's warm, but also there were 16 men per hut, so it would have been pretty crowded in there. They did eventually get nice CPR, like coal burning stoves, and then all of their winter clothing starts to arrive. So this photo on the top right, the guy in the middle with the cap badge, he's wearing a fur hat from Montreal. So they all got like these fur hats that you would have been able to, with ear flaps you could tie under your chin. And proper winter boots and leather mittens. And this photo here you saw on the first slide with my grandfather, and he's wearing that nice sheepskin lined parka. So they eventually did get good material, good clothing, and that just clothing and a roof over your head, and that's made a huge difference in terms of morale. The other thing is Iceland might be lacking on amenities in terms of inside places, but it had a lot of beautiful outside places. And so when they would often just go as tourists just to some of the amazing natural sites of Iceland. So they're at the geyser. This is one of the waterfalls, one of many. And that photo on the right is from one of the famous Icelandic parks where there's like this chasm that kind of splits the two continental plates. So you can walk down this plate that separates the Eurasian plate from the North American plate. And this, I have this photo, nothing has changed. Like I have a photo of that building's still there, like everything is sort of untouched by time, and it's kind of neat. So they did get to go and do things like that certainly was good for morale as well. And hot springs. So Iceland is known for its hot springs, and every small town in Iceland, they had some entrepreneuring, mayor, or like a president, in the early 1900s that decided that every small town should have a pool and a community center, and so they built them in every town across Iceland. And so when transport was available, they would have had their bath rides out to these beautiful spots with pools and showers, and again, just Iceland landscape, ever present around it. So with the locals, because of, I talked about the small pre-war population and there being a lot of fear about what that might be, the Icelandic government stipulated that there was no fraternizing with the soldiers. So there were no social events, there were no organized dances, there were no formal opportunities for soldiers and locals to meet. But certainly they would have, and in smaller communities it was easier when they came into contact with them, shops and restaurants, and officers from both the Canadian and the British really made an effort to meet with business leaders and local mayors and create those relationships and most importantly create channels of communication. Because I think the scariest thing, being a local and is like, it's a faceless army, right? And so once you have open doors and communication and you get to meet them, then you realize that it's not so bad. They also had a lot, as I mentioned, the huge construction projects. So they had Icelanders were hired to work on construction projects all over the country. It was very well paid and very high demand. And there would have been hundreds of soldiers, hundreds of locals working on, even at the air base where my grandfather was stationed, for example. And Iceland always has historically strong ties to Canada as well. Many Icelanders settled in Canada, especially in the late 1800s, after a volcanic eruption that kind of destroyed a lot of the agricultural opportunities. So a lot of them came to Canada. Many of them settled, in Manitoba, where they have these wonderful names with towns with the names of Norse gods. And many of them would have served in Canadian regiments during the First World War, especially they had Viking and Scandinavian regiments out of Winnipeg, for example. So there were those connections. Canada was not this kind of unknown place, and I think once those channels of communication were open, they were able to see who it was that was there. And certainly that was my experience, that everyone was so open and helpful and really interested that I was going in search of this story. And this photo, so this is the photo on the right there, it's a Christmas party. They had, the Camerons rented like a warehouse or something and put on a Christmas party for the local kids. And so that the guy there is the Lobson, he's the battalion interpreter. And so he has, it's a black and white photo, but he's wearing bright red. His white army issue long johns have been dyed red, and he has like a cotton ball beard, and so they showed cartoons and things that they didn't need language for, and gave out chocolate and oranges. So these sort of gestures of goodwill. I don't know the story behind this photo, but I just sort of, again, the sense of like having to make your own fun, because there wasn't that much to do. So this would have been not at Caldadarns, it would have been probably Reykjavik or one of the bigger towns where people were stationed close together. But so there's British and Canadians in the photo, and there was a concert, so they were used to doing this kind of thing to kind of entertain themselves. And this photo is the regiment, Sam Scott. He was the pipe major for the Cameron Highlanders. And so here he is on a little Icelandic pony. And I mentioned that Caldadarns had been a farm, and it was one of many. There were many farm sites around Caldadarn. So once the airbase kind of really started in earnest, the farmer Jornder left with his family because there was just too much going on around him. But there were many other farms that surrounded the airbase, and the Canadians and the soldiers would have had contact with them. They would buy milk and eggs, and they could rent horses. So he probably rented the horse. And there's quite a few photos of men sort of sitting awkwardly on these Icelandic ponies for like, I guess, a photo shoot to send home. And this photo, I think, just sort of inspired, I think, a couple stories in the book. I just like the idea of young men, exploring a new part of the world, on their days off, and adventuring and getting to know the new land around them. So the end of August, I think August 28th, the first half of the squadron of ferry battles arrived from Scotland. And then the second half mid-September. So kind of the airbase would have been at least enough along in its development to land a plane. And also sort of more heavy equipment sort of starts to arrive, the artillery and Searchlight and coastal defense and anti-aircraft guns. And this is a photo of the Bren carriers. This is the Royal Regiment of Canada in their Bren carriers. So, that idea of Fortress Iceland kind of starts to become a little bit more of a reality. The Royals and the Fusiliers left already in October, so they were only there for 4 months. Canada was really keen to consolidate its troops in England, And the Camerons were asked to stay because they were a machine gun regiment and they needed them to defend some of the strategic military installations around Iceland. And so the Camerons stayed as a lone Canadian battalion until April 1941. And when they left, it was actually the Americans that took over from them. So I'll talk about that in 1 minute. But yeah, so they were the ones who kind of helped the British out. So yeah, that's sort of, hopefully that gives you a little bit of a sense of what it would have looked like and been like from a number of different levels. Sorry, I had it on my screen. So this is the Royals and their Bren carriers. And I just want to sort of end with a final story and talk a little bit about legacy. So this photo is an amazing photo. This is actually taken by my grandfather. He should not have had a camera as a private soldier, and he certainly should not have been taking photos of military installations. So the fact that this photo exists is amazing, and I just think it's on the cover of the book. This photo is just so incredible to me. It's one of the ferry battles taking off from the Caldenarns Air Base. In February of 1941, the air base was strafed by a German bomber. And it was sort of the most important thing that happened to them when they were in Iceland. And ironically, after all of their obscurity and sort of being isolated and feeling separated from the war and from their families, they became the center of the war. The plane had taken off from an air base in Norway. It had flown, it had traded its bomb load for fuel so it could fly farther. And it, so it flew like 1,000 miles to deliberately strafe the airfield in Iceland and to sort of show, it was a show of force, a show of strength, to kind of show the British that, Germans could reach Iceland, just because you're there, you're not out of harm's way. And as a show of force, it worked. It really rattled Britain and America. And in March of 1941, so a month after the attack, Britain and the US signed one of the most important agreements of the war that was called the Lend-Lease Agreement, which basically enhanced the flow of materials and armaments from the US to Britain. Until this point, the US had already been supplying Britain, but they had to pay for everything in cash because of the sort of anti-war sentiment in America. America wasn't ready to step in. And this agreement really allowed, and Britain, at this point already, and this is like, 1941 was out of cash. So it enabled America to loan them money, ships, to send goods and materials. It also had agreements in there about stepping out the defense, so the U.S. Navy could defend the shipping lanes farther out. It enabled them to put troops in Iceland, which they did, and this is all like a year before Pearl Harbor. So a year before the Americans actually entered the war in a formal declaration. This brought them closer than they ever had been to the war. And my grandfather was on the airfield that day when they got straight. So, and for me, the legacy is always about relationships. I'm always amazed that a few hundred men 70 years before me could create the foundation for my experiences there. And I know that, like, as I said, Canada's always had a relationship with Iceland. The First Lady of Iceland is a Canadian. So there's modern linkages as well. But when I went in search of the past, I was really amazed about people's interest and just helping me to piece it together. So thank you so much. I'm happy to take some questions if you have them. I have a few, I think I have like 3 books left, I apologize, for sale if you'd like to purchase them. I also have some cards I can give you, and you can buy them online. And thanks again to the Friends of the Museum for this invitation to speak with you today.
So who actually stayed behind after the Camerons left? Did the Americans or the British, or
it was the British to start. So the Camerons left in April 1941, and the Americans arrived already in July. So the British kind of covered it over for 3 months or so before the Americans took over. And it was partly because the British really needed the troops, like they were, fighting a losing war in Crete and in Greece, and they're starting to into North Africa, and so they really needed those troops that were garrisoning Iceland to go elsewhere.
I'd like to know, were the Icelandic men in Iceland, or were they part of some other army or a defense force, or what?
Yeah, they were mostly in Iceland. When I say there was very little industry, the thing that enabled Iceland to become, on some level, the nation it is today is because of the war in Europe. they had uncontested fishing in the Atlantic. And so that was really, so the barrels I showed and the fishing and like this was really a huge economic driver for the country. And so most of them would have been in fishing fleets and things like that. Some of them served in merchant marines. They're by heart a marine nation. So I think a lot of them served in sort of sea-related activities throughout the war. But they didn't, and they still today have no standing Navy or Army or Air Force.
Couple of questions. Was there any acts of resistance by Icelanders?
Very little. There's a couple of things that the main threat was sort of from Russia rather than from Germany. There was a communist party in Iceland, and they were communist sympathizers. And one of the heads of the Communist Party had a lot of influence over the Icelandic government, and so I think that was probably there was a small acts of sabotage and small acts of disobedience, but never on an organized level. And in the summer of 1941, Germany invades Russia, and so Russia becomes an ally, and so that kind of ends a little bit of that whatever resistance there was. It kind of ended it. Yeah.
Just a couple of supplement questions. I know that they strafed them, but was there any attempt ever to land troops by the Germans on Iceland?
No, never. And after the war, they discovered plans by Hitler they had drawn up plans to invade Iceland, and they never came to fruition. I think in part because he decided to invade Russia instead, and so all of their resources and everything went in that direction instead, and also to focus on the U-boat war and to taking the attrition, to do the damage at sea, rather than to take Iceland.
But wasn't the main reason Iceland was important was it provided cover against the U-boats in the Battle of the Atlantic?
Exactly. That's why they were there. That's why it was so important. I think to some, so it was a stopping point for the convoys. So there's this beautiful harbor called Whale Harbor in the south of it. It's huge. It's just this beautiful natural harbor, like 5 miles wide. And so that's where the convoys would come and rest and refuel. There's a huge naval station there. And so it refueled all of the convoys coming from North America. And after Russia became an ally, it also served as the northern route for the Russian ships as well. So like billions of dollars of stuff went through those ports to supply Russia.
Just one final question. Though they prescribed fraternization, was there very many long-term relationships formed between soldiers and
Oh yeah, especially with the Americans, because the Americans were there much longer. The Americans arrived in 1941, and they were there basically until sort of the late. So as you kind of know the history of the Battle of the Atlantic, 1941, 1942. 1943, and so by the end of 1943, they got it under control a little bit better, partly because of better radar, and they also, the Americans built the B-24 bomber that was just capable of flying so much longer distances, and so they were really able to bring the attrition rate of the shipping under control. And so the Americans sort of left, and they didn't leave, but their troops, so they went sort of from 40,000 troops in 1943 down to like sort of 10,000 in 1945, and most of those guys got sent to the Pacific. So most of the relationships were become with the Americans just because they were there longer. And I think the Americans were really, no Americans, they were really lovely and brash and so different from the more uptight on some level, more formal, Icelandic kind of European. And so it was, the ladies liked the Americans.
Mark, did you have a question? I know.
Thank you.
Yes. Okay.
Because that's me, isn't it? Christina, thank you very much for your presentation. When I saw it, I said to myself, this is very, very interesting, because my family has a connection with your story. If you'll indulge me for a minute, go back to April 12th, 1941. A British armed merchant cruiser is patrolling in Denmark Strait, HMS Rajputana, formerly a P&O liner. That's the liner that took Gandhi to England in 1931. The ship had about 20 Canadians under training, One of them was my father, an acting sub-lieutenant, RCNDR, and he had just come off watch at 4 o'clock on the morning of Sunday the 13th of April 1941, Easter Sunday. He was in his bunk, and at 5:45 a massive explosion took place. The ship was torpedoed by a German U-boat, U-108, which had been tracking the ship for some time. And at 7:15, the second torpedo hit. So she went down. My father survived, obviously, but out of a ship's company of 320, about 40 were killed, including several Canadians. My father's lifeboat was picked up by a British destroyer, HMS Legion, and all the survivors were taken to Iceland. And lo and behold, the Canadians were adopted by the Cameron Highlanders for the time that they were there. So I guess that would have been the third week of April.
Easter Sunday.
So the Highlanders were just getting ready to leave.
Yeah.
So that's my connection. And
That's astounding.
And I looked at my father's memoirs and I found the mention of it.
It's I actually talk about it in the book because that story just really resonated with me as well, and I just love that, you know, they were brought to shore and they were given Canadian Army sweaters and rum and sort of adopted by the Canadians. That's amazing that was your father.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Sir? George.
Hi, hi, Christine. Well, thank you. Great read. I was curious. I was curious in the book the act of sabotage, and it kind of was there any follow up to that? Did you ever read anything like that? Did they ever find out the perpetrators of what happened to the sabotage of the plane?
Yeah, they never did. The story comes out of there was a communist priest in one of the seaside towns near the air base, and he had been, you know, causing some trouble. I think he had a radio and he was communicating, you know, with the Russians in Denmark. And yeah, so it's all very vague. Nobody kind of knows how that story ends, and I think he was, you know, protected by his community. And but yeah.
Christine, I just have one question for you. Reference the War Museum's library and research materials. Were you able to find stuff here at the War Museum, or was it not to be?
Not so much. Most of my materials came from the archives in Ottawa, so they would have, you know, those were the Canadian military records. And from the Imperial War Museum actually had some lovely photographs too of the Canadians in Iceland. They, in the early days, probably in the summer after the Canadians arrived, there was a British military photographer, and so he was taking photos of both the British and the Canadians. But there's like maybe 50 or 60 really lovely images of them. Which is really neat. And the only Canadian documentation that I know was there was actually a videographer there. There's a National Film Board film called Guards of the North. It's like 10 minutes long. It's sort of like a propaganda style film with mostly B-roll sort of the guys like on the ship and you know, setting up their tents and sort of working and digging trenches and stuff. And so that's the only documentation that I have of from a Canadian source. Yeah.
I think we'll have one more question if there's one from the floor. Go ahead. And then...
may I know whether there were any casualties from the strafing?
Yeah, there were two. One man was killed, and another one was they were both British. They were defending the bridge in Belfast, and they were on the bridge when the plane attacked. And so, yeah, one man died, and one man was shot in the arm.
So as you can see, we get a sense of the little alarm at the back tells us it's time we need to start to wrap things up. So we're going to do this thank you in two parts. So just stay right there. Scott, I'd let you start with your part if you like.
Thanks very much.
You're welcome. Go ahead.
I just wanted to say, I didn't know this until a couple of weeks ago, but Christina, of course, has come here to visit family all the way from Vancouver. So that took time out of her schedule while visiting family all the way from BC. So the family's here. How many are family here? Put your hands up. There you go. Thanks very much for coming out. And we'll, as I mentioned earlier, we'll have it recorded. We're going to have it on our webpage, and I'll post it on our new LinkedIn page. So if you're following LinkedIn and a member of LinkedIn, follow the Friends of the Canadian War Museum on LinkedIn, and you'll be able to pass that on to other people. Thank you.
So that's fine. Okay, that's part one of the thank you. The second part of the thank you is first of all, I've actually had the opportunity to go to Iceland. I actually did a state visit with Governor General Andrew Clarkson, and I remember seeing these facilities and not having any idea how it all fit together. So when I found out this presentation was going to be held, I was really overjoyed, because that visit to Iceland, you really have to kind of make your way and not really know what's going on. And I was really happy to see that after all the misery they seem to be suffering, they got to go see Goss Falls, and they got to see some of these extraordinary sights in their lifetime, which I'm sure they would. The bad part of the rain they'd have at least those memories of some of the most extraordinary landmarks in the world that you're ever going to see, which is in Iceland. So I think, you know, there must have been good and bad for your dad. It couldn't have been all bad, because I know how beautiful the place was. So it was really nice to hear some really interesting tales, an interesting tale from there. On behalf of all of us here, I'd like to thank you for coming out and doing this for us. We do have a small gift for you, which I'm going to tell the collective about. What I'm about to give her is a gift certificate to our used bookstore, which is actually open right now, and will be open till 4 o'clock today. We're a happy little bunch here, and so I'm giving her a little gift certificate, so if she'd like to go have a peek once she's had an opportunity to visit with you and chat with you and sell a few books or whatever. You have a gift certificate to our bookstore. To meet with her one-on-one, and we do have some coffee and some tea and some treats out, so please feel free to come and help yourselves, and we'll sort of have a little reception. Thank you.